Imagine walking into a real estate office ready to fight for your dream, only to be laughed at, humiliated, and dismissed as if you didn't matter. That's exactly what happened to one elderly woman, until she turned the tables in the most unbelievable way. What started as mockery became her ultimate victory, and by the end she wasn't just a tenant, she was the landlord. Stay tuned for the jaw-dropping story of how one woman's determination not only silenced her doubters, but completely reshaped her future and theirs. Tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will leave you speechless. Evelyn Carter stood at the counter, her hands gripping her old handbag. She didn't flinch under the sharp gaze of Bradley Tucker, the young, smug realtor across from her. His smile was more of a smirk, the kind that made people feel small. Evelyn wasn't having it. "I'm here about the building on Maple Street," she said calmly, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. Bradley raised an eyebrow, barely hiding his laugh. "Maple Street? You mean the building going up for auction?" He leaned back in his chair, looking her up and down. "Ma'am, that's prime property. I don't think you understand the kind of money we're talking about here." Evelyn kept her face blank. She had dealt with men like him before, men who thought the world was theirs, who thought women like her, old and unassuming, were invisible. She had nothing to prove to him. "I understand," she replied simply. "That's why I'm here." Bradley's laugh was loud and sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. The receptionist at the desk next to him glanced over, stifling a giggle. "Listen, I'm not trying to be rude," Bradley said, though his grin said otherwise. "But this isn't a game. Big developers are circling that property. People who can write checks you wouldn't believe. So, unless you've got millions stashed away, I think we're done here." Evelyn's fingers tightened on her bag, but her expression didn't change. "You shouldn't underestimate people," she said quietly. "Underestimate?" Bradley leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "I'm not underestimating you, ma'am. I'm just being honest. You're punching way out of your league." Evelyn held his gaze for a long moment, letting the silence hang. Then she gave him a small, knowing smile, the kind that made Bradley's smirk falter for just a second. "We'll see," she said softly, turning on her heel and walking out of the office. As the door closed behind her, Bradley shook his head and chuckled. To him, she was just another dreamer, another nobody who thought she could play with the big boys. But Evelyn, walking down the street with the cold January air biting at her cheeks, had a different story in mind. Her steps were steady, her chin held high. She didn't have millions, it was true. But what she did have was history, grit, and a lifetime of knowing how to fight back when people like Bradley tried to write her off. Inside her, something sparked. She had let people like him laugh at her before. Not this time. This time, she would laugh last. Evelyn walked back to her neighborhood, the familiar sights grounding her in what mattered. The streets were changing, though. The small corner store she used to visit for fresh bread had turned into a sleek cafe with overpriced lattes and a name she couldn't pronounce. The hardware shop run by Mr. Johnson, who'd fixed her sink more times than she could count, had closed a year ago. In its place stood a boutique clothing store, its mannequins dressed in clothes that no one around here could afford. She paused outside her apartment building, looking up at the weathered brick facade. It wasn't much to anyone else, but to her, it was home. The kind of home that had seen birthdays, funerals, and long nights when she had sat by the window, wondering how she was going to make it through. It had seen her at her worst and her best. Now, someone wanted to tear it all down like it meant nothing. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of cooking, stew maybe, or fried chicken. Kids' voices echoed from the staircase, and Mrs. Thompson's old radio hummed with gospel music from behind her door. Evelyn took it all in as she climbed the stairs to her apartment on the 3rd floor. The building wasn't just bricks and mortar. It was alive. It held memories, stories, and history. Her history. She unlocked the door to her small apartment, stepping into the warmth. A single picture frame on the bookshelf caught her eye. It was a photograph of her late husband, James, smiling on their wedding day. She walked over, brushing a finger over the glass. "You always said this place was more than just a roof over our heads," she murmured. "I never thought I'd have to fight to keep it." Evelyn opened the old wooden chest in the corner of her living room. It groaned slightly under the weight of its lid, revealing a collection of papers, books, and memories. At the very bottom, she found what she was looking for: an old leather-bound ledger with her husband's name written on the front. She pulled it out carefully and sat at the small dining table, flipping through its yellowed pages. The entries were meticulous, James's neat handwriting detailing every expense, every payment, every deal he had ever been involved in. Toward the back, she found something that made her pause. It was a note about the Maple Street building, written in James's hand. Her brow furrowed as she read it, the words sinking in. "Partial ownership," she whispered to herself. James, what were you up to? Her mind started to spin. If her husband had owned part of the building even decades ago, maybe there was something she could use. Maybe there was more to this story than Bradley Tucker or any of those developers realized. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, holding the ledger tightly in her hands. For the first time since she'd walked out of that real estate office, a spark of hope began to bloom. She didn't have money, but she had something far more valuable: a piece of the past. And she was going to use it. The next morning, Evelyn sat at her small kitchen table, the leather-bound ledger open before her. She ran her fingers over the faded ink, rereading the entry that hinted at her husband's ownership of the Maple Street building. It wasn't much, just a single line about a stake in the property, but it was enough to give her hope. She carefully folded the page into her purse, determined to dig deeper. She headed out into the crisp morning air, her breath forming small clouds as she walked to the bus stop. The city moved around her in its usual chaos. Buses screeched to stops, cars honked impatiently, and people rushed past her, their faces buried in their phones. Evelyn didn't mind. The world might have moved on from people like her, but she wasn't about to let it leave her behind. Her destination was the county records office, a dull gray building that had stood for decades, unnoticed by most. Evelyn pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped inside, the faint smell of paper and ink filling the air. She approached the front desk where a bored clerk barely glanced up. "Excuse me," Evelyn said, her voice polite but firm. "I need to look up ownership records for the Maple Street building." The clerk sighed, her fingers pausing over her keyboard. "You'll need to fill out a form," she said flatly, sliding a clipboard across the counter. Evelyn completed the paperwork quickly, her handwriting steady and neat. The clerk handed her a visitor badge and pointed her toward a narrow hallway. "Third door on the left," she said without much interest. Evelyn followed the directions, stepping into a room lined with filing cabinets and old computers. Behind one of the desks sat an older man with glasses perched on the edge of his nose. He looked up as she entered, his eyes narrowing with curiosity. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, his voice kind, but cautious. "I hope so," Evelyn replied, setting her purse down on the desk. "I'm looking for historical records on the Maple Street building. My husband—" She hesitated for a moment, then continued. "He might have owned part of it a long time ago." The man, whose name tag read James Porter, tilted his head slightly. "That's an unusual request," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Most people come here looking for deeds to sell, not for records from the past. What's your interest in this building?" "It's personal," Evelyn said simply, meeting his gaze. "And important." James nodded, something in her tone convincing him to take her seriously. "All right," he said. "Let's see what we can find." He began typing into the ancient computer on his desk, the screen flickering faintly. Evelyn watched as he navigated through layers of records, his fingers moving with the precision of someone who had spent decades doing this kind of work. After a few minutes, he frowned slightly and leaned closer to the screen. "Well, this is interesting," he murmured. "Your husband, James Carter, is listed as having had a partial stake in the property back in 1983. It was a small percentage, but... He paused, scrolling further. It doesn't look like it was ever formally dissolved. That means technically, his claim to the building might still stand. Evelyn's breath caught. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and hope. James nodded, adjusting his glasses. "I can't say for certain without more digging, but this could be significant. If you can prove you're his heir, you might have legal grounds to challenge the sale or even stake a claim in the property." Evelyn felt a flicker of determination rise in her chest. She had walked into this building looking for answers, and now she had a thread to pull. "What do I need to do next?" she asked. James smiled faintly, sensing her resolve. "I'll help you find the paperwork," he said. "It's going to take some time, but if anyone can figure this out, it's me. I've been working these records longer than I care to admit." Evelyn nodded, grateful. "Thank you," she said softly. As James began sorting through files, Evelyn leaned back in her chair, clutching her purse. For the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't just surviving. She was fighting, and she wasn't about to stop now. Evelyn left the records office with a photocopy of the document James had unearthed, tucked carefully into her bag. The words, "partial ownership," echoed in her mind as she walked back toward the bus stop. The city buzzed around her, but she barely noticed. Her thoughts raced ahead, weaving possibilities and plans. If James was right, and her late husband's claim to the Maple Street building still stood, she had a real chance, maybe even more than a chance. But she also knew this wasn't going to be easy. When she got home, the first thing she did was spread the documents across her small dining table. Evelyn had always been methodical, the kind of woman who believed every detail mattered. She studied the copies carefully, her eyes scanning for anything she might have missed. Her husband had always been thorough, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he might have left her something more, something hidden in plain sight. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. Evelyn glanced at the clock, just past 5 in the evening. She opened the door to find her neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, standing there with a tray of food. "I figured you might not have eaten," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice warm and familiar. "You've been running around all day. What's going on, Evelyn? You've got that look on your face, the one that says you're up to something." Evelyn chuckled softly and stepped aside to let her in. "You've known me too long," she said, taking the tray and setting it on the counter. "It's nothing you'd be interested in." Mrs. Thompson raised an eyebrow and crossed her arms. "Evelyn Carter, don't play coy with me. I saw that flyer about the building going up for sale. Is this about that?" Evelyn hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "It is. I'm trying to figure out a way to stop it." Mrs. Thompson's expression softened. "You're a good woman, Evelyn. Nobody fights like you. But this is a big fight. Those developers don't care about us. They don't care about this community." "That's exactly why I'm doing it," Evelyn said firmly. "This building isn't just some run-down property. It's our home. It's our history. If I don't fight for it, who will?" Mrs. Thompson sighed and sat down at the table. "You've got more fire in you than half the people in this neighborhood put together," she said. "But I hope you've got a plan." Evelyn slid the photocopy of the ownership record across the table. "I might," she said. "James, my husband, not the man at the records office, had a stake in this building. It's small, but it might be enough to make them think twice." Mrs. Thompson picked up the paper and squinted at it. "Well, I'll be," she murmured. "I didn't know your James had a hand in this place. That man was always thinking ahead." Evelyn nodded. "He was. And now it's up to me to finish what he started." The two women sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the task ahead settling between them. Finally, Mrs. Thompson reached over and patted Evelyn's hand. "You're not in this alone," she said. "You've got me, and you've got the rest of the folks in this building. If you need help, you just say the word." Evelyn smiled, her resolve hardening. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I'm going to need all the help I can get." Later that night, as Evelyn lay in bed, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, her mind refused to rest. She thought about the people in her building, the lives intertwined within those walls. She thought about Bradley Tucker's smirk and the way he had laughed at her. And she thought about James, her husband, who had believed in her even when she doubted herself. She turned on her side, clutching the ledger like a lifeline. "They think we don't matter," she whispered into the darkness. "But they're wrong. They'll see." The next morning, Evelyn rose early, her determination sharpening with the sunrise. The Maple Street building loomed large in her thoughts, but she wasn't overwhelmed. She had faced worse in her life, losing James, raising 2 children on her own, and keeping food on the table when there was barely enough to scrape by. This was just another challenge, another fight she was prepared to win. She made her way to the community center down the street, a place she had been volunteering at for years. Inside, the hum of conversation filled the room as neighbors exchanged stories, laughter, and worries. Evelyn spotted a familiar face: Marcus Bennett, a young lawyer with sharp eyes and a quiet confidence. He had grown up in the neighborhood, but Evelyn hadn't seen much of him since he left for law school. Now, he was back, helping locals navigate the legal challenges that seemed to come with gentrification. "Marcus," she called out, her voice steady. He looked up from the stack of papers in front of him and smiled when he saw her. "Miss Carter," he said, standing to greet her. "What brings you by so early?" Evelyn sat down across from him, pulling the photocopy of the ownership document from her bag. "I need your help," she said simply. "It's about the Maple Street building." Marcus leaned forward, his interest piqued. "I heard it's going up for sale," he said. "Developers have been eyeing that spot for years. What's your stake in it?" "My husband," Evelyn began, sliding the paper across the table, "had partial ownership in the building years ago. It was never dissolved. I've already confirmed it with the records office. I think I might have a claim, but I need to know if it's strong enough to stop them." Marcus studied the paper carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration. After a few moments, he looked up, his expression serious. "This is a good start," he said. "If your husband's ownership was never officially transferred or dissolved, you could have legal grounds to challenge the sale. But it's going to be an uphill battle. These developers play dirty, and they've got deep pockets." Evelyn nodded, unfazed. "I've dealt with worse," she said. "What do I need to do?" Marcus tapped the paper. "First, we'll need to prove you're the legal heir to your husband's stake in the building. That means paperwork, marriage certificates, his death certificate, anything that ties you to him and his claim. Once we have that, we can start building a case." Evelyn's lips tightened into a thin line. "I have all of that at home," she said. "I'll bring it to you." Marcus nodded. "Good. The sooner the better. And while you're gathering that, I'll start looking into the developers. If we can find any dirt on them, anything unethical or illegal, it could strengthen your position." Evelyn's expression softened slightly. "Thank you, Marcus. I know this isn't an easy ask." Marcus smiled. "Miss Carter, you and my mom used to make me peanut butter sandwiches when we didn't have lunch money for school. Consider this me paying you back." Evelyn chuckled softly, a small spark of warmth breaking through the weight of her task. "Your mama raised you right," she said. When Evelyn left the community center, the knot of anxiety in her chest had loosened just slightly. She had allies now, people who believed in her and were willing to stand by her side. As she walked back toward her building, she saw her neighbors gathered outside, their voices tinged with worry. "Evelyn!" one of them called, a woman named Sandra who lived on the second floor. "They sent letters today." Evelyn frowned as Sandra handed her a crisp white envelope. She opened it, scanning the words quickly. It was an official notice from the Realtor's office, informing tenants that the building would soon be sold, and they should prepare to vacate. Her hands tightened around the paper, anger rising in her chest. Bradley Tucker was wasting no time, trying to scare them into leaving before the sale even went through. But Evelyn wasn't about to let him win that easily. She looked at the small crowd of her neighbors, their faces a mix of fear and uncertainty. "We're not going anywhere," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the chatter. "This is our home, and we're going to fight for it." The crowd quieted, their eyes fixed on Evelyn. For the first time, they saw not just their neighbor, but a leader, someone who wasn't afraid to stand up and say what they were all thinking. In that moment, the fight for Maple Street truly began. Evelyn sat at her small dining table later that evening, her living room dimly lit by a single lamp. The letter from the Realtor's office lay spread out before her, alongside the photocopy of the ownership records and a stack of old documents she had retrieved from the wooden chest. Birth certificates, their marriage license, James's death certificate. It was all there, preserved carefully over the years. Her hands trembled slightly as she sorted through the papers, not from fear but from the sheer weight of the task ahead. She paused as she picked up an old photograph tucked between the documents. It was a picture of her and James standing in front of the Maple Street building years ago, when the neighborhood had been alive with small businesses and families just trying to make it. Evelyn had forgotten this photo existed. She stared at it, her younger self smiling, James's arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. In the background, children played on the building's stoop, and the sun shone bright. The memory hit her like a wave, bittersweet and grounding. "You'd know what to do," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet room. "But I'll figure it out, James. I promise." The next morning, Evelyn was back at Marcus's office, her documents neatly packed in a folder. Marcus greeted her with a quick smile, but his face quickly grew serious as he reviewed the papers she had brought. "This is everything we need to establish your connection to your husband's claim," he said, flipping through the pages. "It's solid, Evelyn, but—" He paused, his fingers lingering on the ownership document. "This isn't going to scare them off by itself. Developers like this, they've got resources, lawyers who live for this kind of fight. We'll need more." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "What kind of more?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, thinking. "They're sending those letters to intimidate the tenants, trying to clear the building before the sale. That tells me they want this done fast, maybe too fast. If we dig into their history, there's a good chance we'll find something shady. Fraud, zoning violations, or unethical practices. It's not uncommon with developers like this." Evelyn nodded slowly. "And if we find something, what then?" Marcus's mouth curved into a faint smile. "If we find something, we use it to stop them, either by threatening to expose them or by bringing the fight to court, but we've got to be ready for them to push back hard." Evelyn leaned forward, her voice low but firm. "I'm not afraid of a fight, Marcus. I've had to fight for everything my whole life. This is no different." Marcus studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, let's get started." Over the next few days, Evelyn and Marcus worked tirelessly. Marcus reached out to contacts who specialized in uncovering dirt on big developers, while Evelyn rallied the tenants in the building. She went door to door, talking to her neighbors, listening to their fears, and reminding them that they weren't alone. "You've got to stay strong," she told Sandra one evening, standing in her doorway. Sandra was holding her young son, her face drawn with worry. "That letter doesn't mean anything. They're trying to scare us, but we're not going anywhere." "But what if they force us out?" Sandra asked, her voice trembling. "I can't afford to move, Evelyn. I don't know where we'd go." Evelyn placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We've got the law on our side, Sandra. They can't just throw us out without a fight. And I promise you I'm not letting that happen." The next morning, Evelyn organized a meeting in the building's courtyard. Word had spread quickly, and nearly every tenant showed up, their faces a mix of worry and hope. Evelyn stood on the front steps, looking out at the crowd. For a moment she hesitated, the weight of their expectations pressing down on her. But then she straightened her back and took a deep breath. "This building is more than just a place to live," she began, her voice strong and clear. "It's a part of who we are. It's where we raised our families, built our lives, and shared our struggles. They think they can take that from us because we don't have the money or the power to fight back. But they're wrong. We do have power, together." The crowd murmured in agreement, the energy in the air shifting. Evelyn continued, her words gaining momentum. "We're going to fight for this building, for this community, and for our future. And I promise you, We're not going to let them win. But I can't do it alone. I need all of you with me." One by one, the tenants nodded, their resolve hardening. It wasn't just Evelyn's fight anymore, it was theirs. As the meeting broke up, Evelyn felt a renewed sense of purpose. The building wasn't just her home. It was a symbol of resilience, of standing up against forces that wanted to erase people like her and her neighbors. Bradley Tucker and his developers might have money, but Evelyn had something stronger, a community that refused to back down. She went to bed that night with a tired body but a steady heart. The fight had just begun, but Evelyn Carter wasn't going anywhere, and neither was the Maple Street building. The next day, Evelyn sat in Marcus's small office, surrounded by boxes of papers and a faint smell of stale coffee. The air felt heavy with the weight of the fight they were preparing for. Marcus leaned over his desk, scrolling through his laptop, his face illuminated by the blue glow of the screen. "I've found something," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. Evelyn straightened in her chair, her sharp eyes narrowing as she watched him. "What is it?" she asked. Marcus turned the laptop to face her, pointing at a news article from a few years ago. One of the developers working with Bradley Tucker was caught in a major zoning scandal about 5 years back. They bribed city officials to get permits for another project. There was a big lawsuit, but they settled quietly to avoid bad press. Evelyn leaned forward, reading the article. "So they've done this before," she said, her voice steady. Marcus nodded. "It's not proof they're doing anything illegal here, but it shows a pattern. Developers like this don't play fair. If we can dig deeper, we might find something they don't want coming to light." Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. "Good. Let's keep digging." Marcus continued his research while Evelyn returned to her building. She went straight to Sandra's apartment, knowing she needed help rallying the tenants for the next phase of their fight. Sandra opened the door, her toddler clinging to her leg, his wide eyes looking up at Evelyn with curiosity. "Sandra, I need your help," Evelyn said without preamble. "We need to gather everyone in the building. It's time to show them that we're not just sitting back and waiting for this to happen." Sandra nodded, her worry from the previous night replaced by quiet determination. "What do you need me to do?" "Spread the word. Tonight we're having another meeting, but this time we're not just talking. We're taking action." By evening, the courtyard was filled with tenants. This time, the crowd wasn't just nervous, they were energized. Word of Evelyn's leadership had spread, and people who had been hesitant to get involved were now stepping forward, ready to fight. Evelyn stood on the steps once again, holding a stack of the eviction notices that had been sent to every apartment. She raised one into the air, her voice ringing out over the murmurs of the crowd. "This," she said, shaking the paper, "is nothing more than a scare tactic. They want us to believe we don't have a choice. But we do. We're not powerless. This is our home, and we have rights." The crowd erupted into cheers and applause. Evelyn let the noise settle before continuing. "We're going to organize. Every single one of us has a part to play in this fight. I've got a lawyer helping us, but we need to do our part too. That means signing petitions, making phone calls, and raising awareness. The more noise we make, the harder it will be for them to push us out." Sandra stepped forward, holding her toddler in her arms. "I'll help," she said, her voice firm. "Whatever you need, I'll do it." Others began to speak up, offering their support. One man, a retired teacher, volunteered to handle the petitions. Another tenant, who worked in local media, offered to reach out to her contacts to get their story in the news. A group of young tenants even suggested starting a social media campaign to draw attention to their fight. Evelyn felt a swell of pride as she looked out at her neighbors. For the first time, she wasn't just carrying this fight on her shoulders. The entire community was rising up, standing together to protect their home. As the meeting ended, Marcus arrived, carrying a file in his hands. He pulled Evelyn aside, his expression serious. "I found something else," he said in a low voice. "What is it?" Evelyn asked, her tone steady. Marcus handed her a photocopy of a contract. "It's a clause in the sale agreement for the building. It says the developers are planning to evict tenants immediately after the sale, even though they're legally required to give notice and follow proper procedures. If we can prove they're breaking tenant laws, it could give us leverage. Evelyn scanned the document, her heart racing. They're counting on us not knowing our rights, she said. But we do. Marcus nodded. We'll need to act fast. If they finalize the sale before we get this in front of a judge, it's going to be a lot harder to stop them. Evelyn squared her shoulders, her resolve hardening. Then we won't give them the chance. We'll fight them with everything we've got. That night, as Evelyn sat by her window looking out at the courtyard below, she felt a flicker of hope. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt like they had a real chance. They had evidence, they had a plan, and most importantly, they had each other. The developers might have money, but Evelyn and her neighbors had something they couldn't buy: unity, resilience, and the strength of a community determined to protect what was theirs. The next morning, Evelyn woke before the sun, the weight of the fight pressing against her chest but not slowing her down. She sat at her small kitchen table going over the notes she and Marcus had compiled. The photocopies of the ownership document, the eviction notices, and the contract clause about the illegal tenant removal lay neatly arranged in front of her. Every piece was another weapon in her arsenal, and she knew she'd have to use them all. Her first stop was the building itself. Evelyn made her way down the narrow staircase, her steps purposeful. The tenants were already buzzing with activity. Sandra and a few other neighbors were working on petitions, gathering signatures from everyone in the building, and even some of the surrounding community members who had heard about their fight. A group of teenagers had started filming interviews with the tenants to post on social media, creating a hashtag, #Save Maple Street. That was quickly gaining traction. Evelyn smiled as she passed them, feeling the pulse of energy in the air. People who had once felt powerless were now standing tall, fueled by a shared purpose. But Evelyn knew this fight wasn't just about rallying the community. It was about hitting Bradley Tucker and his developers where it hurt, legally and publicly. Her next stop was Marcus's office, where he was already waiting with a stack of freshly printed papers and an exhausted but determined expression. "Morning, Miss Carter," he said, pushing a cup of coffee in her direction. "You're going to need this." Evelyn accepted the coffee with a small smile, sitting across from him. "Tell me you've got something," she said, her voice steady but filled with expectation. Marcus nodded, sliding a file across the desk. "I've been digging into Bradley Tucker's record, and it's as dirty as we thought. He's been involved in several questionable deals over the years, overpricing properties, skirting zoning laws, and even evicting tenants without proper notice. None of it ever went to court, though. He's got a reputation for settling before things get messy." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "He's used to getting away with it." "Exactly," Marcus said. "But this time, we're not letting him off the hook. I've already started drafting a formal complaint to the City Housing Authority about the illegal eviction plans. If we file it before the sale goes through, it'll throw a wrench in their timeline and force them to respond." Evelyn nodded, her mind working quickly. "Good. What about the press? We need people to know what's happening here." Marcus leaned back, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Funny you should ask. A journalist from the local paper reached out this morning. She saw the posts about the petition and the Save Maple Street campaign. She wants to do a story on the building and the fight to save it." Evelyn felt a flicker of satisfaction. The pieces were falling into place, but she knew better than to celebrate too soon. "Let's get her here," she said. "The more attention we bring to this, the harder it'll be for them to sweep us under the rug." By midday, the journalist, a young woman named Lila Hart, arrived at the building with a notebook and camera in hand. Evelyn greeted her at the front steps, giving her a firm handshake and a small smile. "Thanks for coming," Evelyn said. "This building means a lot to us." Lila nodded, her expression earnest. "I've read a little about what's happening here. I want to make sure your story gets out there. People need to know what's at stake." Evelyn led her through the building, introducing her to tenants who shared their stories, how long they had lived there, what the building meant to them, and their fears about losing their homes. Sandra spoke about raising her son in the building, how it was the only stable home she had ever known. An elderly man named Mr. Watkins shared how he had moved into the building after retiring, using his savings to make the small apartment his sanctuary. Each story added weight to their fight, painting a picture of a community worth saving. When Lila turned to Evelyn, she asked, "Why are you leading this fight? What makes you believe you can win against developers with so much money and power?" Evelyn's eyes didn't waver. "Because this isn't just a building to us," she said firmly. "This is our home. They might have money, but we have something stronger. We have each other. And when people stand together, there's no amount of money that can take that away." As Lila snapped a photo of Evelyn standing on the building steps, her neighbors gathered behind her. The image felt like more than just a snapshot. It was a symbol of their fight, of their unity. That evening, as Evelyn sat in her apartment, she scrolled through her phone, something she rarely did. The number sign Save Maple Street posts were spreading fast, gaining comments and shares from people far beyond their neighborhood. Some offered support, others shared their own stories of fighting against displacement. Then her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "The complaint is officially filed. They'll have to respond within 10 days. Let's see how they like the pressure." Evelyn leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. The fight was far from over, but the cracks in Bradley Tucker's plans were beginning to show, and Evelyn Carter had no intention of stopping until the whole thing came crashing down. The next morning, Evelyn woke to a knock at her door. She wrapped her sweater tightly around her shoulders and shuffled to answer it. Sandra stood there, clutching her phone with wide eyes. "Evelyn, have you seen it?" Sandra asked, barely able to contain her excitement. "Seen what?" Evelyn asked, rubbing her hands over her arms to chase away the morning chill. "The article. The reporter. Lila. She published the story." Sandra thrust her phone toward Evelyn, who squinted at the screen. The headline read, "The Fight for Maple Street. A Community Battles Gentrification and Greed." Evelyn took the phone, scanning the piece. It painted a vivid picture of their fight, detailing the history of the building, the threat posed by the developers, and the unity of the tenants. There were quotes from Sandra, Mr. Watkins, and others, but the article focused heavily on Evelyn's role as the leader of the movement. It described her as a quiet force of determination, someone who refused to back down despite the odds. The photograph of Evelyn standing on the building steps with her neighbors behind her was featured prominently. It was powerful. Her figure was strong, determined, a symbol of resilience. "This is a good start," Evelyn said, handing the phone back to Sandra. "But an article isn't going to stop them. It's already working," Sandra said. "People are sharing it everywhere. I saw someone on Twitter saying they want to start a fundraiser to help us." Evelyn smiled faintly, but didn't let herself get swept up in the excitement. "That's good, but we've got to keep pushing. This isn't over yet." Later that day, Evelyn joined Marcus in his office. He looked up from his desk, a faint smirk on his face. "You're famous now," he said, gesturing to the article on his computer screen. "I've already had 2 people reach out, offering to help with legal fees if it comes to that." Evelyn sat across from him, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "What's our next move?" Marcus leaned back in his chair. "The complaint we filed with the Housing Authority has put pressure on Bradley and the developers. They'll have to address it before they can finalize the sale. That gives us a window, but we need to hit them harder. We need proof that their eviction tactics are not just unethical, but illegal." Evelyn frowned, thinking, "What about the letters they sent?" "You said they're not following proper procedures." Marcus nodded. "The letters are vague and don't give tenants the proper time required by law. That's one violation. But if we can get someone on the inside, someone who can tell us what the developers are planning, we might find even more." Evelyn's eyebrows raised. "Someone on the inside?" Marcus shrugged. "It's risky, but it could be our best shot." That evening, Evelyn returned to the building, the idea of finding an insider buzzing in her mind. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, she passed Mr. Watkins, who was carrying his trash to the chute. "Evening, Mr. Watkins," she said, giving him a nod. He stopped and gave her a small smile. Evening, Evelyn. I've been keeping up with everything you're doing. I have to say, it's inspiring. Evelyn paused, something in his tone catching her attention. It's not just me, she said. Everyone's playing their part. That's the only way we'll win this. Mr. Watkins hesitated, glancing up and down the hallway as if making sure no one was listening. Then he lowered his voice. I might know something, he said. Evelyn's brow furrowed. What do you mean? He stepped closer, speaking in a whisper. I've got a friend who works at a local law office. She mentioned seeing Bradley Tucker at a meeting there a few weeks back. She didn't hear much, but she said something about them rushing the deal because they're under pressure to close by a certain date. I can ask her to dig around, see if she can find out more. Evelyn's heart quickened. Would she be willing to do that? Mr. Watkins nodded. I think so. She's not a fan of developers like them. I'll give her a call tonight. Evelyn placed a hand on his shoulder. Thank you, Mr. Watkins. This could make all the difference. The next day, Evelyn waited anxiously for word from Mr. Watkins. By late afternoon, he knocked on her door, a cautious smile on his face. She found something, he said, stepping inside. Apparently, the developers are under financial pressure to close this deal fast. If they don't, the investors might pull out. They're cutting corners to make sure everything goes through before the deadline. Evelyn's mind raced. So, if we delay them, they could lose the deal entirely, Mr. Watkins finished. Evelyn sat down, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. This was the break they needed. The developers were vulnerable, and now she had the means to expose them. All they needed to do was stall, just long enough for their plans to crumble under the weight of their own greed. Mr. Watkins, she said, a determined gleam in her eye. You just gave us exactly what we need. Evelyn wasted no time putting the newfound information to use. That evening, she gathered the tenants in the building's courtyard once more. The crowd was larger this time. Word of the article and the growing hashtag Save Maple Street campaign had drawn attention from not just tenants, but supporters from the neighborhood, and even a few curious reporters who had caught wind of the story. Evelyn stood on the steps, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. I've got news, she began, holding up a hand to quiet the murmurs. The developers and Bradley Tucker are under pressure. They're rushing this deal because if they don't close it by their deadline, they stand to lose everything. Their investors will pull out, and this whole plan will fall apart. The crowd erupted in murmurs of excitement and disbelief. Sandra, standing near the front with her toddler balanced on her hip, called out, So what does that mean for us? It means, Evelyn continued, her voice strong, that we've got them right where we want them. All we have to do is stall. If we can slow them down long enough, they'll lose their backing, and the sale won't go through. But how do we do that? Someone asked from the back. They've got money and lawyers. What do we have? Evelyn raised her chin, her voice unwavering. We've got people. We've got power. And now, we've got a plan. She explained it clearly, step by step. First, they would flood the housing authority with formal complaints, using the eviction notices as evidence of improper procedure. Then, they would take their fight public. Protests, petitions, social media campaigns, and more articles to draw as much attention as possible. The goal was to create so much noise that the developers couldn't ignore them. The tenants nodded in agreement, their confidence growing with every word Evelyn spoke. They broke into smaller groups to divide responsibilities. Sandra and a few others would organize a public demonstration outside the real estate office, complete with signs and media coverage. The younger tenants, who had become experts in online activism, would keep spreading the word on social media, ensuring the number sign Save Maple Street campaign reached even more people. Others would focus on gathering more signatures for the petition and connecting with local organizations for support. The next morning, Evelyn and a handful of tenants arrived at the housing authority with stacks of signed complaints. Marcus met them there, his suit slightly wrinkled from the long hours he'd been working, but his resolve was as sharp as ever. This is how we hit them where it hurts, Marcus said, helping Evelyn carry the papers inside. Every complaint we file is another delay they'll have to deal with. The more we bog them down in red tape, the less time they'll have to close their deal." Evelyn smiled faintly, her determination mirrored in Marcus's expression. "Let's make them sweat." The Housing Authority office buzzed with activity as the tenants handed in their complaints one by one. Evelyn couldn't help but notice the clerks exchanging nervous glances as the pile of paperwork grew larger. She knew they hadn't expected this kind of resistance, and that was exactly the point. Later that afternoon, Evelyn joined the protest outside the real estate office. The turnout was bigger than she had hoped, dozens of people holding signs that read, "Homes over profits à Durant and Save Maple Street." Reporters and photographers swarmed the scene, capturing the energy of the crowd as chants echoed down the street. Evelyn stood near the front, holding a sign of her own. Bradley Tucker's smug face appeared briefly in the window above, his expression quickly turning sour when he saw the commotion below. Evelyn met his gaze, raising her sign a little higher, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. By the end of the day, the protest had made headlines. Local news stations covered the story, and social media was flooded with videos and photos from the demonstration. Evelyn felt a surge of pride as she watched the coverage later that evening, knowing they were making it impossible for the developers to operate in the shadows. But she also knew the fight wasn't over. As she sat at her dining table that night, going over the day's events, her phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. "Heard from a contact at the developer's office. They're feeling the heat but still pushing forward. Be ready for their counterattack." Evelyn exhaled slowly, her resolve hardening. She knew Bradley Tucker and his allies wouldn't go down without a fight. But now, the tide was turning. The community had momentum on their side, and Evelyn wasn't about to let them lose it. As the night deepened, Evelyn sat quietly by her window, the city lights flickering in the distance. She thought about James, about the life they had built together in the building that now stood at the center of this battle. "We're not done yet," she whispered into the stillness, "but we're getting closer." For the first time in weeks, Evelyn allowed herself a small glimmer of hope. They had shaken the foundation of the developers' plans. Now, all they had to do was bring the whole thing crashing down. The days following the protest were a whirlwind of activity. Evelyn hardly had time to sit as she moved between her apartment, Marcus's office, and the community meetings. Momentum was building, but with it came new challenges and new risks. The developers weren't about to roll over quietly, and Evelyn knew that Bradley Tucker wouldn't let his ego take the beating without striking back. The first sign of retaliation came in the form of another letter. It was delivered to every apartment in the building early one morning, slipped under doors in pristine white envelopes. Evelyn found hers as she stepped into the hallway, and she knew from the bold font on the front that it wasn't good news. She opened it on the spot, scanning the contents quickly. Her hands tightened as she read. The letter claimed that the building had been deemed unsafe for occupancy, and that all tenants would need to vacate within 30 days. It was an obvious bluff. There had been no inspections, no prior warnings. But Evelyn knew what this was: another scare tactic, an attempt to frighten the tenants into leaving before they had a chance to fight back. By mid-morning, a crowd had gathered in the courtyard, the tenants holding their letters and speaking in panicked voices. Evelyn stood at the center, her presence calming the storm of fear around her. "This is nothing but a lie," she said firmly, holding her own letter up for everyone to see. "They think if they make enough noise, we'll give up. But we know our rights. They can't just force us out without proof." "But what if they send inspectors?" Sandra asked, her voice shaking. She clutched her son's hand tightly, her knuckles white. "What if they actually condemn the building?" Evelyn turned to Marcus, who had joined the crowd moments earlier. He stepped forward, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "They can't condemn the building without cause," Marcus explained. "And even if they try, we can challenge it. Don't let this letter intimidate you. It's meant to scare you, nothing more. If anything, it shows they're getting desperate." The tenants exchanged glances, their fear slowly being replaced by anger. Evelyn could see the fire returning to their eyes, and she used the moment to rally them further. "We've already proven that we're stronger than they expected," she said, her voice steady and commanding. "This letter is their way of admitting they're afraid of us. But we're not going anywhere. We're going to keep fighting, and we're going to win." The crowd broke into cheers, their resolve renewed. Evelyn knew they couldn't afford to lose focus. Not now. She and Marcus spent the rest of the day meeting with tenants individually, helping them draft responses to the letters and making sure they knew their rights. By evening, the letters were nothing more than scraps of paper in the trash, their intended impact completely neutralized. But Evelyn wasn't about to stop there. She and Marcus began working on their next move, leveraging the media attention they had gained to put even more pressure on the developers. Evelyn reached out to Lila Hart, the journalist who had written the first article about their fight. "We need to escalate this," Evelyn told her over the phone. "They're getting desperate, and we need to make sure the public knows exactly what they're doing." Lila agreed immediately, promising to follow up with a second article that would focus on the developers' attempts to intimidate the tenants. Evelyn also coordinated with the younger tenants running the social media campaign, urging them to highlight the scare tactics in their posts. The next few days were a blur of activity. The protest video continued to gain traction online, and the number sign Save Maple Street hashtag was being shared by people across the city. Evelyn even received a call from a local housing rights organization offering legal support and resources to strengthen their fight. But the developers weren't backing down either. Bradley Tucker had started making his own moves, reaching out to city officials and using his connections to try to push the sale through faster. Evelyn heard whispers of meetings being held behind closed doors, deals being struck to sidestep the complaints that had been filed. One evening, Marcus called Evelyn with an update. His voice was calm, but she could hear the urgency beneath it. "Evelyn, I just got off the phone with one of my contacts at City Hall," he said. "The developers are trying to get an emergency approval to expedite the sale. If they succeed, we could lose our window to stop them." Evelyn felt her stomach tighten. "How long do we have?" "Not long," Marcus replied. "The meeting is in 2 days. If we want to stop this, we need to show up. All of us." Evelyn didn't hesitate. She called a meeting that same night, gathering every tenant in the building and laying out the situation. She explained the urgency, the stakes, and what they needed to do. "This meeting is our chance to show them that we're not backing down," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. "We need to pack that room, make our voices heard, and show them that this community matters." The tenants agreed without hesitation. They spent the next day preparing, organizing rides to City Hall and creating signs to bring to the meeting. The younger tenants even designed matching t-shirts with the words, "Save Maple Street," printed boldly across the front. When the day of the meeting arrived, Evelyn led the group into the council chambers like a general leading her troops into battle. The room was packed, the tension palpable as city officials took their seats. Bradley Tucker was there too, sitting smugly at the front of the room, his confidence radiating like a shield. But when he saw Evelyn and the tenants enter, his expression faltered ever so slightly. Evelyn took a seat near the front, her neighbors filling the rows behind her. As the meeting began, she could feel the weight of their expectations on her shoulders, but she didn't let it intimidate her. She had spent her whole life fighting for what mattered, and she wasn't about to stop now. When it was finally her turn to speak, Evelyn rose from her seat and approached the podium. She stood tall, her voice steady as she addressed the room. "My name is Evelyn Carter," she began, her words cutting through the murmurs. "I have lived in the Maple Street building for over 40 years. It is more than just a building. It is a community, a home, a history. And today, I'm here to speak for the people who refuse to be erased." As she spoke, the room fell silent, her words carrying the weight of decades of resilience and strength. Evelyn wasn't just fighting for a building, she was fighting for everyone who had ever been told they didn't matter. And as she looked out at the faces of the city officials, she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going down without a fight. Evelyn's voice filled the council chambers, every word carrying the weight of her fight, her history, and her determination. She gripped the sides of the podium, her eyes sweeping over the room. Bradley Tucker sat near the front, his smug expression replaced by a forced calm that didn't reach his eyes. Behind her, the tenants sat in silence, their presence a powerful reminder of the lives at stake. "We are not just tenants," Evelyn said firmly. "We are people who have built our lives in this building. We've raised families here, cared for each other, and created a community that you won't find in any developer's glossy brochure. Maple Street isn't just property, it's home." The room was so quiet you could hear the scribble of pens as reporters took notes. Evelyn turned slightly, gesturing to the rows of tenants behind her. "Look at us. We are teachers, nurses, retirees, small business owners. We are the heart of this neighborhood, and I refuse to let you erase us because we don't fit into your vision of what this city should look like." One of the council members, a man in his 50s with a gray suit and a calculating gaze, leaned forward. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice measured, "we understand your passion, but the developers have assured us that their plans include community benefits, including affordable housing." Evelyn met his gaze without flinching. "Affordable housing?" she said, her voice laced with quiet intensity. "Let me tell you what affordable housing has meant in neighborhoods like mine. It means a handful of units priced just low enough to meet your quotas, while the rest are turned into luxury apartments that no one from this community can afford. It's not about helping us. It's about clearing us out." The councilman shifted uncomfortably but didn't respond. Evelyn pressed on. "The developers think they can push us out because we don't have the resources to fight back. But we've shown them they're wrong. We've organized, we've filed complaints, and we've exposed their tactics. And we're not stopping until we've saved our home." Behind her, the tenants erupted into applause. The sound filled the chamber, reverberating off the walls. Evelyn stepped back from the podium, her head held high as she returned to her seat. Next, Marcus approached the podium, carrying a thick folder of documents. His voice was calm, but firm, as he presented the legal case against the developers. He outlined the eviction notices that violated tenant laws, the rushed sale that skirted proper procedures, and the shady history of the development firm. He ended with the most damning piece of evidence: the financial pressure the developers were under to close the sale quickly. "This isn't just a case of poor planning," Marcus concluded. "This is a pattern of greed, cutting corners and exploiting communities. If the council approves this sale, they will be complicit in the destruction of a neighborhood and the displacement of dozens of families." The council members exchanged glances, their expressions betraying a mix of discomfort and unease. Bradley Tucker, sitting with the developer's legal team, leaned over to whisper furiously to one of his colleagues. Evelyn watched him, her resolve hardening. For the first time, he didn't look untouchable. The public comment period continued, with other tenants stepping forward to share their stories. Mr. Watkins spoke about his retirement and how the building had become his sanctuary. Sandra described raising her son in a place where she always felt safe. One by one, the tenants painted a picture of a community worth fighting for, their voices raw with emotion. By the time the developers' representatives took the podium, the room's energy had shifted. The slickly dressed spokesperson tried to downplay the tenants' concerns, emphasizing the supposed benefits of the development project. But their words felt hollow, and it was clear the council members weren't buying it. Not completely. When the meeting adjourned, Evelyn and the tenants gathered outside the council chambers. The fight wasn't over yet. The council had delayed their decision, promising to review the evidence and reconvene in a week. But Evelyn knew this was a victory in itself. The delay meant more time to apply pressure, more time to strengthen their case. As the group began to disperse, Evelyn stood with Marcus near the steps of City Hall. The evening air was cool, and the city lights glowed faintly in the distance. "You did good in there," Marcus said, tucking his hands into his pockets. "I think you shook them." Evelyn smiled faintly. "We're not done yet, but it's a start." Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Bradley and the developers aren't going to let this go. They've got too much riding on it. If they push harder, we'll need to be ready." "We will be," Evelyn said firmly. She turned to look at the tenants milling around, their conversations filled with hope and determination. "They didn't think we'd make it this far, Marcus, but we're still standing, and we're not going anywhere." As the tenants began to leave, Evelyn lingered on the steps, her thoughts drifting back to James. She touched the edge of her bag, where the ledger he had left behind still rested. It had been her guide, her reminder that she wasn't fighting alone. His voice echoed in her memory, steady and reassuring. "Stand your ground, Evelyn. Don't let them take what's yours." With a deep breath, she turned toward the street, her steps purposeful as she headed home. The week ahead would be the hardest yet, but Evelyn was ready. She had already proven that she wasn't someone to be underestimated, and when the final decision came, she was determined to make sure Maple Street was still standing, just like the people who called it home. The week leading up to the final council meeting was the most intense Evelyn had ever experienced. The fight had consumed her life, but she didn't waver. Every moment felt like a critical move in a high-stakes chess game. Evelyn spent her days strategizing with Marcus, rallying the tenants, and amplifying their fight through every avenue they could access. The local news channels picked up Lila's follow-up article, and number Save Maple Street was trending citywide. Support poured in from activists, housing organizations, and even strangers who had heard their story and wanted to help. But Evelyn knew the developers wouldn't go down without a final fight. On the day of the meeting, Evelyn woke early, the weight of the day heavy on her shoulders. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple yet dignified outfit, a dark skirt, a crisp blouse, and the small pearl earrings James had given her on their 25th anniversary. She glanced at the photo of James on her bookshelf as she prepared to leave, a quiet determination settling in her chest. "I'll finish this for us," she said softly, before heading out the door. When she arrived at City Hall, the steps were already packed with supporters. People carried signs with slogans like, "Save our community," and "People over profits." The tenants from the Maple Street building stood at the center, their matching t-shirts and determined faces a symbol of their unity. Evelyn joined them, her presence immediately grounding the group. The council chambers were filled to capacity, the air buzzing with anticipation. Bradley Tucker was there, his usual smugness replaced by an edginess he couldn't quite hide. Evelyn noticed the developers' lawyers whispering among themselves, their briefcases filled with what they hoped would crush her fight. But Evelyn didn't flinch. She had come too far to be intimidated now. The meeting began with the usual formalities, the council members seated at their long, imposing table. When it was time for public comments, Evelyn rose from her seat and walked to the podium, her steps steady, her head held high. She felt every eye in the room on her, but she focused on her purpose, on the faces of her neighbors sitting behind her, and on the image of James in her heart. "My name is Evelyn Carter," she began, her voice clear and unwavering. "And I stand before you today not as an individual, but as a representative of the Maple Street community, a community that refuses to be erased." She recounted their fight, detailing the developers' tactics, the fraudulent eviction notices, and the rushed sale. She spoke of the lives intertwined within the walls of the building, and the history it held for the families who had lived there for generations. Every word was measured, deliberate, and filled with the kind of strength that only comes from a lifetime of fighting to be seen. "They thought we wouldn't fight back," Evelyn said, her voice rising slightly. "They thought they could outspend us, outmaneuver us, and push us out like we don't matter. But we do matter. This building matters. Our community matters. And we will not stand by while it's taken from us." The room erupted into applause as Evelyn stepped back from the podium, her heart pounding. But she wasn't done yet. She gestured to Marcus, who stood and presented their final piece of evidence, the contract clause that revealed the developer's plans to illegally evict tenants immediately after the sale. Marcus walked the council through the document, his tone calm but cutting, leaving no room for doubt about the developer's intentions. As he spoke, Evelyn watched the council members' faces. The man in the gray suit looked troubled, his hand moving to adjust his tie nervously. A woman at the end of the table frowned, flipping through the documents before her. Even the usually stoic chair of the council seemed to falter under the weight of what was being presented. When the developer's lawyer took the podium, his voice lacked the confidence it had carried in earlier meetings. He tried to downplay the evidence, but the damage had already been done. The council was listening, and more importantly, the public was watching. After hours of discussion, the council chair finally spoke. "We've heard from all sides today," he said, his tone grave. "And it's clear that this sale cannot proceed as planned. The evidence presented raises serious concerns about the legality and ethics of this development. Therefore, we are halting the sale of the Maple Street building pending further investigation." The room erupted into cheers, the sound like a wave of relief washing over Evelyn and her neighbors. Bradley Tucker's face darkened, his jaw tightening as he whispered furiously to his lawyers. But Evelyn didn't spare him more than a glance. She had already won, and his reaction didn't matter. Back in the courtyard of the Maple Street building that evening, the tenants gathered to celebrate. There were tears, laughter, and hugs shared among neighbors who had become a family over the course of the fight. Evelyn stood quietly on the steps, watching as the people she had fought for embraced their victory. Sandra approached her, her son in tow, and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did it, Evelyn," Sandra said, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved our home." Evelyn smiled, her eyes glistening. "We did it," she corrected gently. "All of us." As the celebration continued, Evelyn slipped away to her apartment. She stood by the window, looking out at the building she had fought so hard to protect. The street below was alive with the sounds of joy and unity, and for the first time in a long time, Evelyn allowed herself to feel at peace. She picked up the photo of James from the shelf, holding it close. "We did it, love," she whispered. "We held on." Outside, the Maple Street building stood tall, a symbol of resilience and the power of a community that refused to give up. And as the night deepened, Evelyn knew she had not just saved a building, she had preserved a legacy. The fight for the Maple Street building wasn't just about saving bricks and mortar, it was about protecting a community, a history, and the lives of people who refused to be erased. Evelyn Carter stood as a testament to the power of resilience and unity. Her journey showed that even when the odds feel impossible, courage and determination can lead to extraordinary outcomes. Evelyn didn't set out to be a hero, but her strength inspired others to believe in themselves, and in the idea that no one is too small to fight for what's right. The Maple Street building stood not only as a physical home, but as a symbol of what happens when ordinary people come together to protect what matters most. As Evelyn looked out at her neighbors, laughing and celebrating in the courtyard they had fought to preserve, she smiled softly, knowing she had done what James would have wanted. The lesson was clear. Unity is stronger than greed, and the heart of a community cannot be bought. If this story inspired you, please subscribe into our platform for more stories of resilience and triumph. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you fight for in your community? Let us know below.